I was halfway through my toast when my cousin laughed loud enough for the whole wedding to hear. At first, a few people smiled automatically, assuming it was just another careless joke. Then he leaned back in his chair, looked straight at me, and said something so disrespectful that the entire table fell silent. I could feel every eye in the room shift between him and me, waiting to see whether I would snap, argue, or walk away. I did none of those things. I just stood there, gripping the microphone, trying to swallow the kind of humiliation that burns long after the moment is over. And then the groom's father slowly stood up. What happened next was the first time in my life I saw someone shut down cruelty without raising his voice. To understand why that moment hit me so hard, you have to understand my cousin Kyle. He had been making people laugh at my expense for as long as I could remember. He had the kind of confidence people mistake for charm. Quick with a joke, loud in every room, always ready with a comment before anyone else had finished speaking. If you met him once, you would probably call him funny. If you knew him for years, you realized most of his humor came from finding the most vulnerable person in the room and turning them into a target. Most of the time, that target was me. Not because I was weak, and not because I couldn't answer him, but because I learned early that peace inside a family is fragile, and once you break it, everyone acts like the person who reacted is the real problem. Kyle understood that better than anyone. If he embarrassed you and you stayed quiet, he won. If he embarrassed you and you answered back, suddenly you were the one making a scene. He spent most of his life hiding behind that trick, and for most of mine, I let him. The wedding was for my younger sister, Hannah. She is 8 years younger than me, and, if I'm honest, I've never been the kind of person who enjoys speeches, dressing up, or standing in the center of a decorated room trying to say something meaningful while everyone watches. But, for Hannah, I would have done a lot of things I normally hated. When our father died, I was 22 and she was 14. She was still young enough to need someone to sign forms, fix problems, sit through school meetings, teach her how to handle life, and act like everything would be okay even when it didn't feel that way. Our mother held us together in the quiet, steady ways strong mothers do. But I knew early that if I wanted Hannah to feel secure, I had to grow up faster than I was ready for. So I did. I worked early shifts, picked up extra jobs, stretched every paycheck, missed weekends, skipped vacations, and learned how to carry responsibility without talking much about it. I taught Hannah how to drive in an empty church parking lot on Sunday afternoons. I showed up to school events in work boots because I rarely had time to change. When she got sick in college and called me in a panic, I drove 2 hours just to leave soup, medicine, and a note that said, "Call me before you panic." That was our relationship. Not dramatic, not polished, just steady. About a year before the wedding, Hannah came by my apartment one evening with a notebook in her lap and said, "I want you to give a toast." I laughed because I thought she was joking. "Hannah," I said, "you know I'd rather assemble furniture with instructions in another language." She smiled and shook her head. "Exactly why I'm asking you." I told her that made no sense. She said, "It makes perfect sense. Everyone else will speak because they like hearing themselves talk. You'll speak because you mean it." I still remember those words. Everyone else will talk because they like hearing themselves talk. You'll talk because you mean it. A week later, I told her yes. That decision would have surprised half my family, mostly because they still thought of me as the quiet one, the practical one, the reliable one, the man who fixed things, carried boxes, drove people to airports, and left before the real talking started. Somewhere along the way, I had become the dependable background character in family lore, useful, steady, and easy to overlook. Kyle, on the other hand, treated every gathering like a stage. Birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, barbecues, funerals, holiday dinners, it didn't matter. He believed silence was an insult. And because he was loud, confident, and socially entertaining, people kept rewarding him for it. They called him spontaneous. They called him fun. They called him harmless. But none of those words ever felt harmless when you were the person he had decided to make smaller in public. The first time I remember it clearly, I was 16. My father had been gone 6 months. I was thinner than I should have been and more tired than anyone knew. At a summer cookout, one of the older uncles asked what I planned to do after school. I said I might take an apprenticeship instead of going straight to college. Before the uncle could say anything, Kyle laughed and said, "That tracks." Daniels always looked like a man born to carry heavy boxes in silence. People chuckled, not because it was clever, not because it was true, mostly because people hate the discomfort of correcting someone in public, especially when he delivers his meanness with a smile. A few years later, at Hannah's graduation dinner, I gave a short speech about how proud I was of her. As soon as I finished, Kyle tapped his glass and said, "That might be the longest speech Daniel's ever given. Somebody write this date down." The table laughed. Hannah didn't. Then at my mother's 50th birthday, after I had spent 3 weekends restoring an old oak table so we could host everyone at home, I stood to thank her for everything she had done for us. Before I finished my second sentence, Kyle leaned toward another cousin and said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "He always sounds like he's auditioning for a documentary." Again, laughter. Again, the same cheap pattern. Never enough to start a family war. Always enough to leave a mark. That is the real damage people like Kyle do. It is not that they insult you once. It is that they teach everyone around them to treat your humiliation like part of the atmosphere. Over time, the room starts expecting it. If you are the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who does not want trouble, your discomfort becomes the price of everyone else's comfort. And after a while, even you start paying it automatically. By the time Hannah's wedding arrived, I had become very good at swallowing things whole. The week before the wedding, I practiced the toast every night. In my kitchen, in my truck, in the laundry room of my apartment building, once even in a hardware store parking lot, because I arrived early and didn't want to waste the time. I kept editing it down because I hate speeches that sound like they are trying too hard. I wanted it to be honest. That was all. I wanted to talk about who Hannah was when nobody was applauding. I wanted to talk about Michael, the groom, and why I respected him not because he was flashy, but because he was consistent. He listened more than he spoke. He kept his promises. He carried things without being asked. He had the kind of steadiness that makes other people breathe easier. That mattered to me. I had lived long enough to know that marriage is not sustained by excitement alone. It is sustained by patience, restraint, loyalty, and the ability to protect peace when ego wants to win. I wanted to say something worthy of that. On the morning of the wedding, I was standing near a side table, folding and unfolding the note card in my pocket, when Kyle walked up beside me with a cup of coffee and that familiar expression. "So," he said, "I hear you're giving the big emotional speech." I nodded once. "That's the plan." He smiled into his cup. "Keep it short. Weddings aren't endurance sports." I gave him the smallest possible answer. "I'll do my best." He laughed softly. "No, really. A lot of people here don't know you like we do. You might want to ease them into the whole sincerity thing." Then he walked away before I could reply. That was his style too. Leave the insult behind like a bad smell, then disappear before anyone could force clarity on it. The ceremony itself was beautiful in the quiet way weddings sometimes are when people stop trying to impress each other and simply pay attention. I stood near the front with the rest of the family and watched my sister begin a new chapter of her life. Even a man who dislikes public emotion can feel the weight of a moment like that. Afterward came the reception, warm lights, polished silverware, flowers arranged with more patience than I will ever understand, and the soft hum of happy conversation. Plates were cleared. Glasses were set down. The DJ made a few announcements. Then the toasts began. Michael's best man went first. He was funny without being disrespectful, which already put him ahead of half the men I had grown up around. The maid of honor gave a short, graceful speech. Then the DJ said my name. The walk from my chair to the microphone was not long, but I felt every step. Not because I was afraid of speaking exactly. I was afraid of being made into a joke before I could say anything that mattered. I adjusted the microphone once, looked toward Hannah and Michael, and took a breath. If you know me, I said, you know this isn't where I'm most comfortable. A few people smiled gently, but if you know Hannah, you know she has a way of making people do things they never planned on doing. That earned a soft laugh. Good, I thought. Easy, steady. I looked at my sister. I've had the privilege of knowing her longer than anyone else in this room except our mother. So if I say a few things tonight that sound less polished than they should, I hope you'll forgive me. I've never been good at turning important things into performances. That was when I heard Kyle laugh. Not a chuckle, not an accidental sound, a deliberate, sharp laugh from the middle of the room. A few heads turned. A few people smiled uncertainly. I kept going. When Hannah was 14, I said, she had this habit of pretending she didn't need help with anything. Kyle leaned back in his chair and said loudly, this should be good. Daniel's doing feelings. Nervous laughter scattered across the room. Heat crawled up the back of my neck, but I kept going. She liked people to think she had everything under control, I said. But what I learned pretty quickly was that strength isn't about pretending you don't need anyone. It's about showing up for the people you're responsible for. Then Kyle cut in again. Who gave him a microphone? He said. Seriously, he sounds like he practiced this in the mirror. That was the line that changed the room, because now it was no longer a careless joke. It was a man interrupting a wedding toast to humiliate someone who had done nothing except stand there and speak sincerely. The difference between those two things is obvious when you have character, but a lot of people only recognize it when someone braver than them says so. And for one awful second, nobody did. The room froze. I heard a fork touch a plate somewhere in the back. Someone shifted in a chair. My aunt, Kyle's mother, suddenly became fascinated by the centerpiece. My mother wore the expression I knew too well, the one that mixed anger, embarrassment, and the desperate instinct to keep the peace. Hannah's face tightened at once. Michael's jaw did the same. I stood there with the microphone in my hand, and for one brief, ugly moment, I wanted to disappear. Because public disrespect does something specific to a person. It does not just hurt. It tries to recruit you into your worst self. It whispers, answer him, humiliate him back, drop the speech, make him feel it. And I knew that if I did, the night would no longer belong to the bride and groom. It would belong to the insult. I refused to give him that much power. So I took one breath, then another. I lowered my note card slightly, looked out across the room, and said nothing. That silence probably lasted 3 seconds. It felt like 30. Kyle must have mistaken my calm for weakness, because he smirked and sank deeper into his chair as if he had already won. He glanced around, waiting for more laughter, more approval, more proof that he could reduce another meaningful moment to a bit. Then a chair moved, not loudly, not dramatically, just the sound of wood sliding back across the floor. Everyone turned. The groom's father, Richard Bennett, stood up. Richard was not a flashy man. He was not the kind of authority figure who needs the room to know he is in charge. What made him noticeable was the opposite. He carried himself with disciplined stillness, the kind of man who listens fully before speaking, and when he finally does speak, people hear more than words. They hear standards. I had only met him a handful of times before the wedding, enough to know he was decent, enough to know Michael had inherited a lot of his steadiness from him, but not well enough to expect what happened next. Richard set his napkin down beside his plate, looked directly at Kyle, and spoke in a voice so calm the room had no choice but to go completely quiet. "If a man is standing to honor his sister," he said, "you let him finish." That was all at first. No shouting, no insults, no performance, just one sentence. Kyle gave a small laugh, the thin kind men use when they realize the room is no longer with them. "Hey," he said, "I was only joking." Richard did not sit down. "I know," he said. That's the problem. You could feel the shift immediately. Not just in Kyle, in everyone. Because in one sentence, Richard had done what no one in my family had ever bothered to do. He named the thing honestly. He stripped away the disguise. He took mockery dressed as humor and called it what it was. Kyle tried another smile, but it was weaker now. "Come on," he said. "We're just keeping it light." Richard shook his head once. "No," he said. "A wedding toast is not the place to make another person smaller so you can feel bigger." The room stayed still. I remember one of Michael's uncles folding his hands and looking down. I remember the DJ stepping back from his booth as if even he understood that this was no longer entertainment. I remember my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Richard took one step away from his chair, not threatening, not dramatic, just unmistakably clear. "Tonight," he said, "my son and his bride are beginning a life together. A moment like that deserves blessing, respect, and gratitude. If you cannot offer those, the least you can offer is silence." Kyle's face changed then. First, disbelief. Then, irritation. Then the quick, calculating look people get when they realize the room has moved beneath them and they no longer know where to stand. He opened his mouth again, probably to defend himself, but Richard lifted one hand just enough to stop him. "No," he said. "Listen carefully. There is a difference between humor and humiliation. A mature man knows the difference. A decent man does not need it explained twice. I do not think I will ever forget that line. Some sentences do not just silence a room, they reveal it. Suddenly all those years of that's just Kyle. And he doesn't mean anything by it, and you know how he is, sounded exactly as weak as they had always been. Because here was a man from outside our family's habits and excuses hearing the same behavior in full daylight and recognizing instantly what it was. Cruelty, cheap, casual cruelty. Richard turned slightly then, enough to include the room without taking his eyes off Kyle. "We do not shame people for sincerity at my son's wedding," he said. "If someone has the courage to stand up and speak from the heart, you honor that courage, even if you would not do the same yourself." Nobody moved. Hannah was pressing her lips together, trying not to cry. Michael placed a hand over hers beneath the table. My mother had tears in her eyes, too, though whether from anger, relief, or regret, I could not have said. Kyle looked around for support and found none. His mother kept her gaze down. The cousins who usually laughed with him suddenly became very interested in their water glasses. For once in his life, he was alone with his own words. Then Richard looked at me. "Daniel," he said, and his voice softened slightly. "Please continue." Then he sat down. That was the moment the air in the room changed. It was not applause yet. It was something better. It was the quiet recognition that, for once, a line had been drawn around the right thing. I stood there for a second, almost unable to believe what had just happened. My hand was still tight around the microphone. My note card had gone damp in my palm, but something inside me, something that had spent years bracing for impact at family events, loosened. I looked at Richard. He gave me the smallest nod, as if to say, "Go on. The room is yours again." So I did. I took a breath and glanced at Hannah. When Hannah was 14, I said, my voice steadier now than it had been a moment earlier, she liked to act like she didn't need anyone. A few people smiled, this time with respect. But life teaches all of us, sooner or later, that strength is not about pretending to stand alone. Real strength is knowing how to stand with the right people, and how to become the right kind of person for others. I turned toward Michael. One of the reasons I respected Michael from the beginning is that he understands that. He doesn't need to dominate a room to have presence. He doesn't need to say 10 things when one honest thing will do. He is patient. He is dependable. And in a world full of performance, he is refreshingly real. Now the room was with me, not because I had won an argument, but because truth, once protected, has a way of settling people into themselves. I looked back at Hannah. My sister has always had more courage than she advertises. Most people see confidence when they look at her. I see something deeper. I see loyalty. I see persistence. I see someone who keeps showing up for the people she loves, even when life asks a lot from her. And that matters, because marriage is not built by two perfect people standing in perfect light. It is built by two imperfect people choosing respect when they are tired, patience when they are tested, and kindness when kindness is not the easiest option. No one laughed. No one interrupted. I continued. A lot of people think love is proven in grand gestures, the expensive trips, the big announcements, the perfect photos. But the older I get, the more I believe real love is proven quietly. It is proven in how you speak to each other when nobody is watching, in whether you protect each other's dignity in public, in whether you make room for grace when one person is struggling and the other could have chosen pride. If the two of you can build a home where respect is normal, where mercy is not rare, where apologies come without ego and loyalty survives inconvenience, then you will have built something stronger than excitement. You will have built peace. And peace is one of the rarest blessings any home can have. I saw Michael lower his head for a moment, the way men do when they are trying not to show too much emotion in a room full of people. Hannah smiled at him, then at me. "Hannah," I said, "you once told me that the strongest people are not the loudest. I do not think you realized how much I needed to hear that. So tonight I want to say this. Never let the world convince you that gentleness is weakness, that patience is passivity, or that respect is something old-fashioned people talk about, because they do not understand modern life. Respect is not outdated. It is the foundation of everything that lasts. Michael, thank you for being the kind of man I can entrust my sister to without pretending, without performing, and without fear. Thank you for being steady. Thank you for listening well. Thank you for understanding that love is not possession, it is responsibility." Then I lifted my glass to a marriage built on mercy when life is hard, laughter that never comes at each other's expense, honesty that does not need cruelty to feel strong, and a home where both of you always feel safe, respected, and seen. To Hannah and Michael. The room answered in a wave of sound. Glasses lifted. People said their names. And then the applause came, not the loud, chaotic kind people give to spectacle, but the full, genuine kind people give when something true reaches them. I sat down slowly. Hannah leaned forward, reached for my hand, and squeezed it hard. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "That was perfect," she whispered. Michael nodded at me. "Thank you," he said quietly. I just nodded back. Across the room, Kyle stared at his plate. That should have been the end of it. In a healthier family, maybe it would have been. But people who build themselves on small public humiliations rarely know what to do when they fail in front of witnesses. They either disappear or they try to rewrite what happened. Kyle chose the second option. About 20 minutes later, while dessert was being served and people had started moving around the room again, he approached me near the side hall where the staff had set out coffee. He still had that half-casual posture, but his mouth was tight. Can we not make this into a whole thing? He said. I looked at him for a moment. I didn't make anything into anything. He exhaled sharply. You know I was joking. There it was. The oldest shelter of the cowardly. I kept my voice even. No. You were testing whether you could embarrass me in public again. He glanced around, lowered his voice, and said, You always do this. You take everything so seriously. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so familiar. That sentence had followed me for years, not after people treated me unfairly, but after I noticed it. Some things are serious, I said. A wedding speech is one of them. He crossed his arms. Richard didn't have to grandstand. I took a sip of coffee before answering. That wasn't grandstanding. That was a man stopping you because no one else had before. For a second I thought maybe he would finally say something honest. Maybe he would admit he went too far. Maybe he would apologize like an adult. Instead, he shrugged. Whatever, he said. You got your moment. I set my cup down carefully. No, I said. I got to finish a toast I should never have had to defend in the first place. He started to answer, but someone called his name from the far end of the hall. He looked away. That was fine with me. I had no interest in wresting truth out of a man who had spent his whole life dodging it. Later, near the entrance, my Aunt Linda stopped me. She had spent most of Kyle's life doing what some parents do when they are too afraid to correct their children honestly, translating misconduct into personality. Daniel, she said in a low voice, I'm sure Kyle didn't mean anything by it. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. With respect, Aunt Linda, that's exactly the problem. He always means something by it. Everyone just pretends he doesn't. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I was not angry when I said it, and that mattered. Anger would have made it easy for her to dismiss. Calm made it harder. He's been doing this for years, I said, at birthdays, at dinners, at every event where someone else is allowed a sincere moment. And every time, people tell the person he embarrassed not to make trouble. That only teaches him there's no cost. Her eyes dropped. I never wanted a scene, I continued. That's why I stayed quiet for so long. But quiet should not be mistaken for agreement. She nodded faintly. I understand. I do not know if she truly did, but it was the first time I had ever seen her with no defense ready. A little later, my mother found me near the coat room. She did not speak at first. She just touched my arm, and in that touch was the weight of 100 moments she had seen, half seen, or chosen not to force into the open because she had been trying to hold too many people together at once. I'm sorry, she said finally. For what? For how often you've had to absorb things just to keep peace. That hit me harder than Kyle's comments had, because parents, even loving ones, sometimes ask the strongest child to carry silence like it is a family duty, not out of malice, out of exhaustion, out of habit, out of the mistaken belief that the child who can bear it should bear it. I squeezed her hand. It's all right, I said. She shook her head. No, it isn't. But I'm proud of how you handled it. That meant something. Not because it erased the past. It didn't. But because truth had started entering places where excuses used to live. Before the night ended, Richard Bennett found me standing alone for a moment on the terrace outside the reception hall. The air was cool. The music inside had softened. Through the glass, I could see people gathering coats, hugging goodbye, drifting toward the end of the evening. Richard stepped beside me and folded his hands in front of him. "I hope I didn't overstep," he said. I turned to him immediately, not even close. He nodded once, like he had expected that answer, but did not need praise for it. "My father used to say something," he said. "If you let mockery stay at the table, gratitude gets up and leaves." I let that settle. He believed that the way people behave during another person's sincere moment tells you almost everything you need to know about them. Anyone can celebrate success. Not everyone knows how to honor vulnerability. I looked out into the dark parking lot beyond the lights. "No one in my family ever said it that plainly," I admitted. "Then they should have," he said. He wasn't harsh, just honest. After a moment, he added, "You handled yourself well, better than a lot of men would have." I thought about that. I wanted to answer him. "I know," Richard said. "That's why it mattered that you didn't." Then he smiled slightly. "And for what it's worth, the speech was excellent." That made me laugh, the first easy laugh I had all evening. "Thank you." He nodded and started back toward the hall, then paused. "One more thing," he said. "A person who protects the dignity of others will never be the weakest one in the room. Remember that." Then he went inside. I stayed on the terrace another minute after he left. Not because I was upset, but because I needed space to understand what had just happened. All my life, I had thought dignity was mostly private, something you held inside yourself while people misunderstood you, overlooked you, or took small bites out of your peace. I thought strength was mostly endurance. Keep calm, do your duty. Don't complain, don't make trouble. Don't be the reason the gathering falls apart. And there is honor in restraint. I still believe that. But that night taught me something else. Restraint matters most when it is paired with truth. If no one ever names the wrong, the patient person becomes a storage room for everybody else's bad behavior. I did not want that anymore. In the weeks after the wedding, I noticed subtle changes. At the first family dinner after that night, Kyle was quieter. Not transformed. Men like him do not become humble because one evening went badly, but the room had changed around him, and that was enough. The cousins who used to laugh fastest now looked careful before joining in. My aunt interrupted him once when he started to make a jab at someone else. My mother no longer gave me that let-it-go look. Even silence had changed. It no longer felt like an order directed at me alone. A few days after returning from her trip, Hannah called me. "You know what Michael's dad said after everyone left?" she asked. "No." "He said, a family can survive tension. What it cannot survive is teaching people that disrespect is normal." I leaned back in my chair. "That sounds like him." She laughed softly. "He also said you looked like you were about to throw your note card into orbit." "That also sounds right." Then she got quiet. "I'm glad he spoke up," she said. "But if he hadn't, I would have." "I know," I said. And I did know. But there was something powerful about the fact that it had been Richard, an elder, a father, a man with no investment in our family's excuses. He spoke not out of emotion, but out of principle. He defended not just me, but the meaning of the moment itself. A few weeks later, Kyle texted me. It was exactly the kind of message people send when they want the comfort of reconciliation without the humility it requires. Didn't mean for things to get weird at the wedding. Hope we're good. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I wrote back, "I'm not interested in pretending nothing happened. If you want to apologize honestly. If not, let's keep some distance." He never replied. That was answer enough. And honestly, distance can be its own kind of peace. People talk a lot about forgiveness as if it automatically means restoring closeness. I do not think that is true. Sometimes forgiveness means refusing to carry bitterness. Sometimes wisdom means refusing to reopen the same door for the same kind of disrespect. Both things can exist at once. Months passed. Hannah and Michael settled into married life. My mother seemed lighter somehow, as though naming the pattern had relieved her of pretending not to see it. I found myself speaking a little more directly in other parts of life too, not rudely, not dramatically, but clearly. At work, with relatives, with neighbors. I realized how many situations I had handled by absorbing discomfort, because I thought that was maturity. Sometimes it was. Often it was just habit. And habit is not always virtue. The older I get, the more I think real maturity has less to do with being unbothered and more to do with knowing what should and should not be tolerated. Patience is a virtue. So is clarity. Silence can be noble, but not when it becomes a hiding place for cowardice, yours or anyone else's. When I think back to that night now, I do not mostly remember Kyle's laugh. I remember the pause after it. I remember the room holding its breath. I remember feeling the old familiar temptation to shrink so other people could stay comfortable. And I remember a chair sliding back across the floor. I remember a man standing up, not to dominate the room, but to restore it. That matters to me more than the humiliation ever did. Because for years I had accepted a false choice, either endure disrespect quietly, or resist it so loudly that I became part of the disorder. Richard showed me a third way, calm, firm, honest, without cruelty, without spectacle, and without surrender. He did not insult Kyle. He did not humiliate him for sport. He simply refused to let bad character hide behind humor. And in doing that, he gave me back more than a speech. He gave me a clearer understanding of what dignity looks like when it is protected in public. If there is one thing I carried from that wedding, beyond the joy of seeing my sister begin her new life, it is this: a sincere moment is a trust. When someone stands up to speak from the heart, at a wedding, a funeral, a graduation, or any moment that matters, they are placing something vulnerable in front of others. How people handle that tells you everything. The mature protect it. The shallow exploit it. The wise know the difference instantly. Kyle thought he was laughing at me. What he was really doing was revealing himself. And Richard, with a few steady sentences, made sure everyone saw it clearly. That night, I learned that dignity does not always arrive in the form of applause. Sometimes it arrives in the calm voice of an elder who refuses to let cruelty pass as humor. And once you have seen that, it becomes very hard to settle for anything less.